I'm going to butcher your last name.
Don't worry.
How do you
Keep it.
you say it?
Matskas. I can.
Matskas.
I'm still butchering
Christos
myself.
Matskas. Okay, thank you. And we are here for a developer's guide to Microsoft Identity. So here we go. We have a word from our sponsors coming up, and I'm going to play that video for you right now. Let's share my screen and include the computer sound. Got to remember that. Get that going. Here we go. Thank you.
Do you face daily challenges while working in SharePoint? Would you like to automate processes, save time, and work more efficiently without having to rely on power users? You can! QuizCom is your one-stop solution for all your SharePoint needs. With 10,000 plus clients and over 70 SharePoint and Office 365 products, we offer a solution for any SharePoint requirement. Let's take a glance at a few of our products. No-code, smart, and secured forms. User-friendly and highly customizable organization charts. Data aggregation across your SharePoint Online tenant and MS Graph API. SharePoint and Exchange Online calendar aggregation. One-click convert to PDF and print. When using a third-party app, have you ever wondered how secured your data is when it's processed on a vendor's cloud server? All QuizCom apps are SharePoint hosted apps, which means your data never leaves your tenant. Discover how QuizCom can solve your SharePoint frustrations. Go to www.quizcom.com today and try out any QuizCom product for free.
All right. Sponsors like QuizCom make conferences like this happen. So thank you very much to our sponsors. And if at any time you have a question for Christos, please type it into the chat and I will alert him that you have a question. And take it away, Christos.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Happy time zone to everyone who's joining us. My name is Christos Matskas, as we've already said, and I work at Microsoft as a program manager for the identity division. Hence the reason why I'm here to talk about identity and have some fun. If you like what you see, and if you want to learn more about identity, if you want to know how to actually secure your SharePoint access to your other data, or look at end-to-end scenarios, then I actually stream, or we have a show called the 4 to 5 show every Tuesday and Friday at 8 a.m. Pacific. It's on Twitch, it's on YouTube, it's actually everywhere. And even if you miss it, you can always catch up on YouTube. The whole point there is to help you as developers or as IT pros to actually write secure applications. And that's the reason why we're here. In the meantime, we really want to thank our sponsors for their support and for actually making this event a reality. I know how hard it is to put events together. I've done it in the past, and kudos to the Chicago team for setting this up. And I think there's going to be a forum in the end to to give some feedback on my session and other things. Now, let's talk about security and why identity is so important. This morning, I woke up and one of the news was that one of the biggest meat producers in the world, based in Brazil, I didn't know that, they produce 1/3 of the world's meat, has actually been hacked, which means that the whole operation has ground to a halt, and that will affect meat deliveries and meat production across the whole globe. This was an attack to the operations of that meat factory. It was an organized attack. People are saying that it could probably be a state-sponsored attack, which brings us to the reason why identity and why security are so important. I don't know if you've ever heard of Have I Been Pwned? If you haven't, then I would highly recommend that you go and check the website. It's run by Troy Hunt. He's an Australian security expert. And what he does is every time a website gets hacked and the user data gets dumped somewhere in the public, he grabs the data and uploads it to his system. And what you can do is go and insert your email. And then every time your email turns up in one of these hacks, you get notified that your password has actually been hacked, and therefore people can go and use your credentials to sign into other websites. And you might say, well, you know what? I don't really care if people sign into my Facebook or YouTube, or even my Netflix account. Right? It's fairly safe. Did you know that $200 million were lost last year to attacks that happen like that? People would grab your username and password, sign into Facebook, pretend they're you, and then they would put a message like, "Hey, I got stranded in the middle of nowhere. I lost my wallet. I need some emergency cash. Please wire me some money here." And then your friends will rush to your rescue and try to save you. Obviously, it's not you; it's somebody else, and then they run away with money from your friends. $200 million are lost that way. So it doesn't really matter what you do, what your operation is, whether you have a very innocuous, just standard website that has a forum for your friends to talk about your latest gaming escapades, or whether you have a mobile app that tracks fitness, or whether you're a business like the meat production company in Brazil, or Walmart, or anyone else. Any company that operates in the public domain will become a target. And it's scary to think that 11 billion accounts have actually made it to these hacking dumps where everyone can use. And this information is sold around, and it's hard. It is really hard to get security right. I get it. I in fact, fell victim to my own vanity and lack of awareness when in 2007, I worked as a consultant and I got a contract. The company hired me to create a CMS, a content management system. And rather than me getting something off the shelf, WordPress ain't got nothing on me because I can write better software. I decided to create my own CMS. And since a CMS needs to have different, very varied levels of access, you can have an admin, you can have a user, you can have an editor. I decided to roll out my own identity system. And I thought it would be fairly simple. Just a username and a password, you store it in the database, and you move on. It turns out that it took me 3 months to work through the whole system, because it's not just a username and password. I mean, it starts with that, but then again, you have to think about brute force attacks. What happens if somebody tries to send like 100 million email and password permutations through your website? What will happen? What happens if someone tries to lock accounts? What happens if somebody tries to use rainbow attacks? What happens if somebody tries to DDoS your website? There were so many things. And then multi-factor authentication, and setting that up requires a number of services outside your website. So identity was tricky, and I didn't know about that, and I spent 3 months trying to implement it, which set me back quite a bit as a consultant, if you know that. So we don't want people to feel that pain. We want people to be successful when it comes to implementing identity. And you know what? I can actually start with a demo, because what better way to start rather than doing a demo? So let's say you're decided to use Microsoft Identity. We'll say why Microsoft Identity later on, but let's say I've convinced you. So now we're doing it, and we're going to create a new app. And we're going to do a JavaScript app, but later on I'll be doing .NET, and then everything I show you works across multiple languages, so it doesn't have to be JavaScript or something else. And everything starts with an app registration. This is where I come into Azure Active Directory, and I say, you know what, I want to sign in some users to my application. So here we need to say, I'm going to create a new app registration. We'll call it Chicago JS, right? It's a JavaScript application. Don't judge me about the language. Every language works. And I'm going to leave everything else blank. We'll say just register, which means that we've showed our intent. Now, I don't know JavaScript. I'm not a JavaScript expert. So the platform can actually guide me to with a sample. You can say, you know what? We have quick starts for you. We can help you get off the ground quickly. And the whole reason why I'm doing this demo is just to show you that identity doesn't take a lot to be implemented. It's just a few lines of code. And that's very important when we compare it to my 3 months of effort. When you work with JavaScript, there are different frameworks and different tools. Obviously, we support Angular and React, which are the most popular ones out of the box. There's special libraries that work with React and Angular, so you don't really have to do wrappers or components. We also support vanilla JavaScript, and then there will be more components coming in, like Vue.js or Aurelia. If you want to see dedicated tools for those languages and frameworks, then do let us know, and we will implement them. But for now, we're following the most popular one. For this one, we're going to use plain old JavaScript. The nice thing here is that I don't have to go and do any other changes. The guide will do it for us. We assume that the local demo will be running on the port 3000 on localhost. So let's make that update. And then I'm going to download the code sample. And I'll download and open it and see what happens, right? So let me just grab that. Let me go into our projects. No, I don't want to do that. I want to do this. So many folders, so little time. So let's paste that here. Yes, we'll replace the old demo. And then I'm going to come here and I'm going to open it in code. And I'm going to walk you very quickly through this demo, right? So it's a simple application. It doesn't do anything magic. We have a server that serves on port 3000 using Node. And then in the front, we have some static websites. There's an HTML page that it's used to interact with us. That's what we use for running the application. There's one little JavaScript file that does all the code, the UI changes when something happens. And then there are two files. There are two main files. One is the config. This is where we say or we declare how we're going to interact with Azure Active Directory. So it's MSAL is the Microsoft Authentication Library, and the config expects a client ID. This is the application registration ID, so it matches. We have the authority. We're saying we're going to use Azure Active Directory, and this has our tenant here, the information. And finally, where do we expect to get the signed in information once the users sign in? Now, there's nothing here that interacts with the user's credentials. Everything happens on the Azure AAD side of things, the Azure Active Directory. I could leave everything else blank here, so technically you just need 3 lines of code, 8 to 10. And then there's an auth file. We have different ways for you to authenticate. One is via pop-up, and the other one is via redirect. Depending on the implementation or the target browser, sometimes you want to use a redirect, but the default option is a pop-up. So in the pop-up, what happens is when you click on the sign-in, and we'll run the demo very soon, you're presented with the sign-in, you're actually redirected to a page, and that redirection happens here, line 48 to 52. So you get redirected, you sign in, and then you come back, and then it changes the UI. It literally takes 3 lines of code in JavaScript to do a sign-in. The sign-out is even simpler. It's 1 line of code, and it happens. If you add the request, and it's like 5 lines of code, so fine. So 4 and 5 were like 9 lines of code so far. And finally, since this is a Microsoft 365 conference, we're also going to be calling into Graph to get some information. So we get an access token to be able to call into Graph to get some emails back. And that's probably another, let's say, 10 lines of code. But all in all, in 20 lines of code, I'm able to sign in users, sign them out if they need to, and get some access tokens to call some Azure resources. So let's see it in action. What I'm going to do here is terminal, open the terminal, and npm install, because it is a JavaScript app after all. Npm install. Don't think it has anything to install. Oh, okay, there you go. And then npm start. Ta-da! It's listening on port 3000. So let's go to that URL and see what happens. Localhost 3000. Aha, well, that's a giant one. That was really zoomed in. As you can see, a lovely sign-in button. It says, which account do you want to sign in? I want to sign into that tenant where I created my application, my test tenant. It's the first time I'm actually using the application. Therefore, I'm prompted to consent to the permissions. The application needs to ask for my consent so it can access my data, and I need to give my consent. This creates a bit of trust. If this application was asking for my OneDrive and for my pictures and everything else, then that would be a little bit dodgy, because all we're doing is looking at our emails. So this is where I can actually check whether the application is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And actually, if it's a malicious one, or you get prompted, if you ever get prompted for a sign-in through Azure Active Directory to something that you don't recognize, you can actually report it as well. I know it's a little bit tiny, but let's make it bigger. So you can actually report it, and then we can investigate on our end whether somebody is trying to access your data, or your admin can look at that. In the meantime, I will say I accept to sign in and look at my profile information. So as soon as that happens, let me actually zoom out a little bit because the UI is all garble. See, it brought my information. I can actually see my profile, which is part of the ID token there. And then, you know what? I want to read my emails. We talked about graph, right? So here, again, those 10 lines of code will go and read my email. You see the permission here it asks. And because I haven't consented yet, it actually asks me for it. So I will say accept. And lo and behold, the data comes back and I get my emails. So in 20 lines of code, I was able to sign in, sign out, or you know what, I can sign out now. And I'm not going to complete that because I don't want to fully sign out from Azure AD, but this will kill my my cookies. And there you have it. With JavaScript, it's super easy to do it. And in other languages, it becomes even easier. Java, Node, .NET. We have languages and libraries for all these frameworks. So we want you to be successful. What you didn't see here, because I was already signed in, is that this tenant is already also configured for multi-factor authentication. So if I was fully signed out and I tried to sign in, it will prompt me for a 2FA on my phone, and I would have to enter that. I didn't have to code anything. In fact, you saw it was only 3 lines of code to implement everything end to end. Let's carry on with the slides. I know slides are not as fun or as exciting, but I promise I will have more demos in a bit. So we talked about why we don't want you to store passwords locally. Well, I said it's easy, but other than that, or you could be hacked. We know that a lot of companies get it wrong. I've been in companies where they had all these different systems, and all these different systems has their own user names and passwords, and it's very hard to consolidate for IT teams. It's a nightmare. And there have been cases where I walked into a company and people had left the company 2 years ago, still had access to production systems because it was very, very hard to find where all these users were stored or where all the information was available. So imagine that an admin leaves your company and then 2 years later can still access your company portal on the public domain. It's very scary. It's very very hard to manage. And also all these different databases will have different kind of security implementations. Some of them could be using Mongo, some of them could be using SQL, some of them could be in NoSQL, and it's very, very hard. So one central location to manage everything is the ideal scenario. And Azure Active Directory can scale, right? It can scale from 1 user to 30 billion authentications per day. So you could be signing in 1 user on your system, it will still be absolutely fine. You can sign 30 billion people a day and it will still be fine. So as a developer, I don't ever have to think about how is my database going to scale. Now imagine if you had to manage that database yourself. You just add a few lines of code and off you go. Now, usually it starts with, hey, Chris, I want you to go and create a website and sign in our users. Perfect. So if you are a developer, the first thing you're going to look into is an existing system. Many companies may have already existing systems, but most of the companies that have Office or Azure will already have an Azure Active Directory for free. It's available to them for free. It's already available to them out there. Therefore, you don't have to pay for third-party software. You don't have to pay for extra services. You already have an Azure Active Directory sitting there for you. And even if you don't have that one, you can always use a Microsoft 365 developer tenant to play around, which is free forever. How easy can you start? I showed you. I'm not really a JavaScript expert, and it took me 5 clicks and 2 command line prompts to do everything, to run my JavaScript application. I can take that and build on top of it, or I can take those components and add them to my existing JavaScript app, and off we go. You don't really need to know how things work. Does it support or integrate with tools? Yes, Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, IntelliJ, right there. You bring the ID that you want, and we will support you. In fact, we have extensions for Rider, which is a third-party ID. We're building support for IntelliJ as well. So if you're a Java developer, you could actually get a file, new project, add authentication, off you go. And if you're using Visual Studio Tools, you know we got your back. Finally, this is very important. I like this. It's the advanced security capabilities that you get out of the box. Now, if you're looking at MFA, it's tricky. You have to have an email service and a text service, and you have to have a lot of logic behind the scenes to make sure that when somebody enters their MFA account, their MFA code, you can actually check that it has been expired, it hasn't been compromised, and what have you. So a lot of complex logic. You don't ever have to code about that. We also have conditional access, the ability to conditionally allow people to access your application based on certain criteria. Coding around that, it's an insanely hard task. There's one console or one page in Active Directory where you configure everything and can apply multiple policies to multiple apps and therefore scale. And you as a developer don't ever have to think about how these things are implemented because they're enforced by Azure Active Directory. And there's also exciting things coming like continuous access evaluation for invalidating tokens. There's token binding, and again, you get all these things for free. I've already shown you the app registration. You can do it in the portal. You can do it through PowerShell. You can do it through .NET notebooks if you want to, or Python. There are all these APIs that allow you to not only test it through the UI, but also make it part of your CI/CD and automate the process. Once we do that, then the next component for integrating with Azure Active Directory is use one of the libraries. We use the MSAL library for this one, or MSAL browser for JavaScript, because that's the default library. If you're using Java or .NET or any other framework, we also provide you with libraries, and that's the easiest way to get started if you're new to identity. However, you might say, well, I have deep experience, in-depth experience around OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, which are the protocols that we built upon. And if that's the case, then you can bring your own libraries. If you already have a mature library that uses these features, then you don't have to use our libraries. You can bring whatever, because our endpoints are OIDC certified or OpenID Connect certified, and therefore they work with other libraries, Node.js Passport, for example. And in some cases, if you need to call into other APIs, for our example, we call the Graph API, and therefore we didn't really have to go and do anything else. But if you're calling your own APIs, then in that case, you might have to go back to Azure Active Directory and do some changes in the configuration of your app registration. But that's all you need, technically. And in many cases, developers don't even do that. Their IT admin will do the configuration based on the criteria you need, and then or the criteria of your app. And then you as a developer, all you have to do is just consume it based on the configuration settings I've shown you earlier. Who can sign in? Now, that's a very important question because there are different flavors of the Microsoft Identity Platform. At the very least, the one decision I have to make is, am I signing in people in my organization? Am I building a line of business app and I only want internal users with @Contoso or @Microsoft to be able to sign in? Or am I signing external users? Like I want somebody to, I'm building a website and I want people to come and buy my t-shirts. I'm creating t-shirts. And for that, they need to create an account and they need to create a profile and they need to enter some information. Therefore, they're not part of my organization. These are all external people to my company. Or think of Walmart or Target or anyone else that you go and buy stuff. You have an account there. That account is external, and therefore you're not using Azure Active Directory. You're using Azure Active Directory B2C, business to consumer or business to customer. And that means that I can sign in with my Facebook account, I can sign in with a username and password, or I can sign in with any other OpenID Connect provider. Simple as that. You just have to make this decision up front, and then everything else just works. And then there are like more advanced scenarios, but I'm not going to cover them here. And then I mentioned about industry standards. We don't have anything proprietary. Everything we do is part of the wider consortium around identity and security. Like I talked about continuous access evaluation, the ability to invalidate tokens at any time. This is something that we're working with the wider industry to make sure that we have a unified way for implementing that. Okay, so I've shown you the demo with JavaScript. I want to jump ahead and bring some wow here. So we want you to come as you are. We don't want you to, just because you're using Azure Active Directory, to move to Azure. We don't want you to move to .NET. We want you to stay where you are or do what you enjoy the most and still be successful and secure when it comes to managing identities. Therefore, if you like to develop with JavaScript, with Java, using IntelliJ and run your solutions in DigitalOcean on a container or serverless or even on the VM, then we will support you. In fact, at Build, we just announced the ability to extend your infrastructure if you're running on Azure to non-Azure infrastructure. So for example, you can deploy a cluster of app services onto your on-premises environment using Azure Arc. And right now it doesn't support identity out of the box, but once the fully featured GA capabilities come around, we hope to have identity embedded into that, which means that your web app running on Azure Arc on your own server under your box will be able to behave and act as an Azure VM, and therefore get the ability to automatically get an identity to communicate with other resources. But if you don't want to do that, if you want to run on a totally different data center or a totally different language and stack, then we can still support you with that, which is important. However, if you are running on the Microsoft stack, if you are using Visual Studio and Azure and Power Apps and Microsoft 365, and you want to integrate tightly with everything else, then that is provided to you out of the box. And there are some advanced capabilities and features such as managed identities. So I could have my website authenticate to Azure Active Directory and call into other resources without me configuring anything. It's like a turnkey authentication that gets automatically passed through the whole chain of services. And we talked about B2C a little bit. I'm going to again mention here that B2C is not just for signing users, but you can also create business solutions around that with APIs and complex services that all authenticate to each other via B2C. So it's not just a simple consumer signing platform. It is a username and password at its basic form, but it can support some really advanced scenarios, including MFA, including conditional access, and all that goodness. And the nice thing about B2C is that unlike the standard sign-in form that you saw earlier on, it actually gives you a customizable UI to provide the same look and feel as the rest of your application. And therefore, you can easily play around and customize the experience. So customers don't feel like they're going somewhere else and they're coming back. They are doing that still. But that next page that they go to authenticate looks and feels very similar to your existing app, and therefore it provides a better UI experience. And it scales with your customers. In fact, B2C is free for the first 50,000 users. You don't have to pay a single penny. 50,000 users can sign in unlimited amount of times every month, and you will still pay nothing for it. And I think once you hit 50,000, it's a good problem to have, right? That's a good. And then there's the scaling kind of cost where it scales up based on how many users you have. But being able to get off the ground and reach your 50,000 users, that's amazing. Other benefits that you get with Azure Active Directory, obviously, is single sign-on. This is very important. I use my phone all the time, and it has a million Microsoft applications. I don't even have to think about how to sign in. I don't even remember my password. The Microsoft Authenticator app on mobile apps or my iPads actually enables me to do single sign-on to all these applications without me having to enter anything. So your customers don't have to think about, or your users don't have to think about how are they going to sign in. Or think about Salesforce, right? Your company runs Salesforce or Dropbox, and your users need to integrate. You don't want them to have a Salesforce account. You want them to have their Azure Active Directory account and use that to sign in. That is fully supported, and we support so many thousands of apps on the platform. Now, let's switch gears very quickly. .NET. .NET has done a fantastic job in improving the experience and getting developers off the ground as quickly as possible. In September 2020, we introduced the Microsoft Identity Web Library, which made developers' life a lot easier. We unified the sign-in and the token acquisition experiences, because up until that point, you would sign in and then you had to grab another library to be able to acquire tokens for other services. That was a big disconnect for our developers. Therefore, we introduced that, and as Marcia's showing there, it's easy to do. Therefore, Bob should be able to adopt the same capabilities as Marcia. Microsoft Identity Web is supported on anything .NET Core 3.1 or later. If you're still using older frameworks or on older versions of .NET Core, then unfortunately you still have to go with the MSAL approach. But it is built on top of MSAL. We support everything on ASP.NET Core, but if you are Java, JavaScript, Python, or anything else, the MSAL library is the one for you, as I showed you earlier on. And then finally, you can also bring your own library. So if you don't want to use any of these things and you want to do it yourself, then there's a very healthy ecosystem of OpenID Connect libraries that you can use instead of ours. I want to skip through that because there's a lot of fluff. The whole point there is that we took hundreds of lines of code that you had to use to sign in and validate tokens, and we made them we abstracted them. We made them very easy to integrate with, and you don't have to worry about all the plumbing. It's done for you. So if you're running in .NET, I'm going to show you a demo very, very quickly. you can still tap into all the underlying plumbing, right? So if you don't want to use Microsoft Identity Web, or if you want to use it, but you still want to configure the UI, make it slightly different. If you want to look into the cookie authentication or JWT tokens, then you can also do that. There's nothing stopping you from doing it, but for getting started or getting off the ground quickly, we can do it with one line of code. And I literally mean one line of code. So I'm gonna show you now as we jump to our demo. I think the next one's a demo, isn't it? Oh. You know what? I have it hidden. So let's go back to our terminal. No, I said terminal, not this one. So if you're not using Windows Terminal, then I would highly urge you to do that. It's fantastic. It even comes with Quake mode. That's the most exciting bit of build. If you watched build this year, I'm just kidding. Right, so we're in the project. Let's go and create a new .NET project. So .NET new. We're going to create a web app, and then we're going to name it Chicago. And then I'm going to do --auth, and then we'll say single log. This means I'm going to use Azure Active Directory for authentication, and everything should be wired up. Now, I haven't tested this with .NET 6, and I have .NET 6, so let's see what happens. It's an experiment. If not, I have older versions so we can run them. Okay, so here, everything is there. It's been spun up. Let's go and look at the code. .NET 6 Preview 4. If you are, oh, you know what? I did not change directory. Let's open in code. Okay, what do we have here? We have our CSproj file. This is where we define our libraries. You will notice that we have Microsoft Identity Web, as I mentioned before, and we have a UI that drives the sign in and sign out. Then we have our startup. Yes, let's restore our app. We have our startup here. In line 32, we actually wire up our authentication. This is where we say add authentication to the middleware, so people that come to our website need to sign in before they access anything, and that's our default authorization here, which comes with everything else. There's a line in 42 that says wire up the UI as well, so when people won't need to go to the sign-in page, we know where to direct them. And finally, there is a user authentication. Now, I did say it's going to be one line of code, so let's change that to be one line of code. Add Microsoft Web App Authentication, right? Then we pass the configuration, the default one, because everything is default. That's the one line of code here. See, told you, it's easy. Now let's go and get some settings. As you can see, this is the default that comes out of the box. So let's change that to be our tenant. Let's go and configure our app registration now, so we can run it. Let's go and create a new one. Remember, this time it's going to be different because we're not using JavaScript, so we'll say Chicago.net. And I'm going to register. We have the client ID. Let's grab that. Let's put in here. Let's grab the tenant ID. I should know by heart by now. I've done so many demos here with this tenant. And finally, I'm going to grab this one. This is where we expect to get our tokens back. So back in our app registration, the last step is to say how we want to authenticate. We're going to authenticate with a .NET app. So I'll press that. And then we know it's running on Kestrel. So it's HTTPS, colon, localhost. And because it's Kestrel, it's running on port 5001 by default. And then I'm going to paste our redirect URI, sign in OIDC. You can change that if you want to change things. So here I'm going to say configure, we're done, save, everything is there. So now, technically, if I go back here, save everything, and let's run it. Terminal, new terminal. Oh, we have one problem. Ah, yes, obviously. Comments are not permitted inside JSON. I don't know why we put the comments there, but hey, it is what it is. So .NET build. I usually do .NET run, but I haven't run it with the preview version of .NET. Oh, it worked. You're seeing it here. first .NET 6 preview 4 with identity. So .NET run. Will it run? Let's see. Dun, dun, dun. It is running on port 5001, as we said. So let's go and navigate that. See what happens. Aha, I'm prompted for authentication. Perfect. I'm already signed in, so no 2FA, remember? I get prompted to consent. Yes, I will. It works. There you go. .NET 6, preview 4 with identity works. 1 line of code, I didn't lie, and 4 lines of configuration, which is fine. It's just configuration, but you can see how easy it is to get started. And then I can, I can add some more bells and whistles here. So for example, we could say, you know what, I want to also call some API downstream, and I also need to have a cache to store my tokens. I can also inject graph here if I want to. So let's switch gears to what is graph and why you should care about it, and how awesome it is. So graph. What is graph and why should you care about it? I mean, it's a Microsoft 365 conference, so I suspect that you know about graph, but we'll do it anyway. What is graph? Graph is the one API to rule them all. All your data, all your organizational data, it is accessible through the graph, whether it's SharePoint, OneDrive, your emails, Exchange. Not only can you access it, but you can also manage it through the graph. So it's the data plane and the management plane all wrapped in one thing, which means you can automate a lot of things. You can query data. It scales very well, and it can create some really immersive, really delightful experiences for your users. For example, most of you send email. Every time you go to the to field to type your email address, we actually execute a graph call to the graph API, and I think we're using the people endpoint. And that query or that request asks for the 10 most popular people you work with. Therefore, every time I try to type an email to my team or JP or somebody else, the first options that come up are based on popularity. This is data that the graph learns about you, and therefore it helps you to be more productive. So I never really have to check or look at the GAL about these people. And if I have to look up somebody in the GAL, in the global address book, then it actually executes a graph call to bring that information back, which is perfect. It saves me so much time. What else can you do? We can respond to OneDrive updates and then trigger some other execution all through graph. You could change your lights in the room by just responding to graph status. So there's an API that checks your team's status. You can use that to say, well, if I'm busy on a call, how about you change all the lights in the room to red, and if I'm free, change all the lights in green. In fact, Scott Huntsman showcased that demo back in 2020 at Build. So if you want to see that working in action, how the code was put together, you're welcome to do so. Graph is quite complex. It allows you to connect with all these different things, and it is available to consume on anything. PowerShell, Azure CLI, any language you want. They have SDKs and APIs for all the languages out there. And even if there's no library for you, there's a very well documented RESTful API. Probably one of the best documented APIs I've ever worked with. So if we want to do a demo, the easiest way to get started with Graph is through the Graph Explorer, aka.ms. Some of you may have already used it, so I'm going to try to showcase not just the basic stuff, but also some advanced capabilities. For example, it's going to sign me in. You can change it to be any tenant. You can also don't have to sign in if you don't have an account. It will use test data. The first thing that it defaults to is my data, my profile. I wish I could close this. There you go, a little bit more space. There's a beta endpoint as well, which is our evergreen beta. We test features there. Once we're happy with them, we move them to the V1, our GA version, but you can test both, and there are separate libraries for both. You can actually get code snippets. So if your manager says you need to integrate with Graph and do some queries, you can say, yeah, well, it's going to take me a week. And then you can come here, run your query, and filter it out, and you're done. So for example, here, if I wanted to say, you know what, I want to select, let's say I want to select my, about me, what do we want? Maybe my ID, city. There you go. So the code also changes based on that, which means that I don't really have to know how to code it. It will just do it for me. Easy peasy. You can also grab your access token and use that to bring it into your code. So maybe you just want to quickly test your graph. Here you can see how you can access it. You can also check your permissions. So for example, for me to be able to access my me endpoint and read stuff, I need to have at least user.read permissions. Once I have that, or one of these permissions here will allow me to read this data, which means that if you're working with different data points, like let's say I want to look at Excel insights. Let's go to OneDrive. Okay, I need to be able to check my recent files. I probably don't have any files, but check this out. Do I have any files? Yeah, I do have some sample files. Now here you'll see that the permissions change. It actually guides me through what I need to do. At minimum, you need file.read to be able to read your files. I can also do read all and cite read all, and then you can also do read write if you want to add some data, which is great. And then you have that one, you have the code snippets, you even have adaptive cards, which are part of the Graph Toolkit. If you haven't used this before, check this out. You don't even have to know what the API looks like. You just get an adaptive card, you copy that into your code, and you're done. So there are so many things that you can build with Graph. We use it all the time. I use it all the time for things like the other day, somebody said, can you create a .NET interactive notebook that uploads files to OneDrive using the large file API? It's like, yeah, it took me 5 minutes. I came here, copied the code, and I was done. So really powerful. The Graph Explorer is a fantastic tool to play with and to get started. It gives you the code in different languages as well, JavaScript, Java, so you don't even need to know how to integrate with other libraries. Again, it will do it for you. And I think there's a RESTful API, so that's the REST endpoint, shows you how to do it. And that's it. I think that leaves us with a few minutes for questions if you want to ask anything. Let me quickly go back to our slides because I think I have a couple of slides left. Nothing fancy. Again, if you like what you saw, if you want to know more about identity and security on any platform and any language, make sure to join us, make sure to follow. We're there every Tuesday and Friday at 8 a.m. Pacific, so I'll be 10 a.m. your time. See, it's more reasonable to you. And as always, the M365 Chicago is running a charity, so please make sure to help out by donating. And that's the community. There's raffles and giveaways, which is great. I don't think I qualify, but it's fine. And then if you liked or if you didn't like my session, please make sure to leave some feedback, and hopefully I'll be back next year for the next round. Thank you for sitting with me for the last 45 minutes. Any questions?
No questions in the meeting chat just yet, but I do have one comment. That QR code, by the way, guys, I think that's the old one, but the link is correct. Sorry, guys.
Does the URL work at the bottom?
Because the URL at the bottom, I do believe, will work.
Okay.
But the QR code will probably take you to, I believe, the last conferences thing. We'll post a new one in the general chat later today when we have time to generate a new one. We noticed that just a few moments ago. It's the little things you forget.
Oh, you know what? I've done conferences before, and I know it takes an insane amount of organization and effort to put stuff. So there's always going to be something missed.
Yeah. But any questions in the chat, guys? Can you guys chat? Yeah. It's kind of quiet.
Well, usually if there's no questions,
someone did post something earlier, so I know they can.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's either been too good or too bad. I either lost people halfway through, or I explain things very well, and therefore no questions.
Yeah.
It's a tricky subject, so I totally get it.
Yeah.
Hopefully I managed to demystify some things and show how easy it is to get started. By the way, I'll be around. I'm also on Twitter, so if you want to reach out to me on Twitter, we also have a Discord if you want to use our Discord. We also have like a very vibrant community there, so you can come and ask all sorts of things around Azure and identity. It doesn't have to be just identity. Our community is great, including Graph. The Graph team is very close to us. And therefore, we give you access to all these resources if you need some support. aka.ms Discord. 45 so Discord. And I'll make the slides available to you later, so if you want to download them and go through them.
Great.
And this is the Microsoft 365 developer program. If you want to get the full Azure Active Directory, where you can work and act as gods with full admin permissions and a P2 tier, like all the bells and whistles, then just join here. It's free. It renews every 90 days. So as long as you use it once every 90 days, it will be available to you for free forever with fresh data every day.
All right. Well, if there are no questions, I'm going to say thank you, Christos, and we'll see you around on the chat, I guess, or Twitter, and we will chat later. Or wait, I think I have a new message. Oh, that's from the next presenter. All right.
Well, in that case, thank you very
All
much
right.
for having me. Have a fantastic day and rest of the conference, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Great. See ya. Bye-bye.